Welcome to our new lecture on EU-Russian relations, and today we finish the block on energy relations, and we're going to talk exactly about EU-Russian energy relations. Previously we discussed Russian energy policy, the structure of the Russian energy sector, then we covered the EU's energy policy, and today we are going to bring the two actors together and to see what's going on in energy, which is still the biggest part of EU-Russian relations. But first, the statistics. The first slide demonstrates you the relative importance of Russia and the European Union in oil and natural gas. In terms of oil, the EU imports about 88% of the oil that it consumes. The European Union imports about 88% of the Russian oil export, which constitutes about 30% of the EU's consumption. Yeah? The European Union also imports about 70% of Russia's natural gas import, which constitutes about 23% of the EU's consumption, or about 34% of the EU's import. So the interdependence of the two actors is huge. But actually we cannot talk about an asymmetric dependence of one party on the other, rather it's really mutual interdependence. And the mutual interdependence is further illustrated by the next slide, which you have already seen, and that's a map of oil and gas pipelines. And we see that most Russian oil and gas pipelines run to the European continent, to the EU's part, to the European Union, and link Russia and the European Union. And in that sense, yes, indeed, Russia and the European Union are closely interconnected. Russia tries to diversify away from Europe and more to Asia. The European Union tries to diversify away from Russia, but still this interdependence in oil and natural gas exists. It's very pronounced, and it's not that easy to decrease precisely because of the infrastructure. Continuing a bit further, Russia and the European Union are closely interconnected in electricity and nuclear energy. If we talk about electricity, Russia exports quite some electricity to Finland and to Lithuania. It does not import electricity from these countries, and the amounts are clearly small. Russia also exports quite a lot of coal to the European Union, and that's about 50% of Russia's coal exports, which constitutes about 30% of the EU's consumption, of the EU's imports, We know that the European Union is self-sufficient in coal, but at the same time, the environmental legislation and social legislation within the European Union is very strict, and therefore they have to rely on the import. And in case of nuclear energy, quite a lot of facilities that operate in the European Union were constructed by Russia or by the Soviet Union, and Russia still supplies quite a lot of nuclear materials to those places. The European Union limits the share of nuclear materials that could be supplied from one external supplier, and the limit is, the threshold is 20%, but at the same time the European Union actually consumes much more nuclear materials, many more nuclear materials from Russia, and the share allegedly reaches 40% due to all sorts of temporary exceptions and temporary deals. That again illustrates close interconnection between Russia and the European Union, and it is for this reason that recent energy security documents of the European Union in fact mention nuclear energy and nuclear dependence on Russia. If we compare strategic thinking of Russia and the European Union, and that's the EU's triangle strategy on the one hand, and Russian energy strategy for the period to 2030, there is actually quite a good complementarity. If we speak about security, Russia is interested in energy security, in the security of supply, and the security of demand, The European Union is definitely interested in the security of supply and in the stable energy flow. So there is compatibility. There's quite a bit of compatibility here. Russia is interested in clean energy. The European Union is interested in clean energy as well. Russia's interest is probably more declaratory, and Russia is definitely focused on energy efficiency more than on anything else. The EU's priority lies with CO2 emissions and with the decrease of CO2 emissions, but still we do speak about strong complementarity here. One priority that does diverge in Russia and the European Union is about liberalization and market making. The European Union talks about internal market construction and liberalization. Liberalization being bringing in competition as much as possible to the energy sector. Russia rather talks about the need to modernize the sector and about budgetary efficiency of the sector, which is the ratio between what Russia invests and what Russia gets out of the energy sector. But still, there is quite some complementarity, not only in terms of production and consumption, but also in terms of policy. And that's why Russia and the European Union seem to be natural energy partners in energy, and this is why they launched the energy dialogue in the year 2000, in Paris in October. And the first stage of the energy dialogue lasted from the year 2000, from the very time when it was launched, until the year 2007. And I suggest calling this stage an exploratory stage, where a patchwork approach was practiced. Patchwork because several meetings were held and areas of short-term and long-term cooperation were identified. Then this difference between short-term and long-term was eradicated, and basically the parties continued cooperating on a list of priorities. 5 priorities were important. The first one is long-term guarantees for the security of supply. Long-term guarantees for the security of supply were of 2 kinds. The first was about natural gas, and more specifically about long-term contracts that for quite a long period of time ensured the security, the stability of supply, but at the same time that were challenged by the liberalization processes in the European Union. In the end of the day, long-term contracts were preserved, but some of the provisions of the long-term contracts were modified so as to satisfy the demands of the EU's liberalization. The second part of long-term guarantees for the security of supply dealt with nuclear field, and more specifically with nuclear materials, and with the 20% limit that the European Union puts on all external suppliers. Russia tried to do away with that limit, but unfortunately it's still in place, so there was no success in that area. Secondly, Russia and the European Union discussed the investment climate and investment promotion. Initially it was more about Russia's investment climate, about how Russia regulated its energy market, but then as the time went, it increasingly was about the EU's liberalization, because Russia argued that the EU's liberalization challenged the stability of the investment climate, the way it was set up when Russia started investing in pipelines or in the downstream facilities in the European Union. Thirdly, Russia and the European Union talked about technological exchange, and they developed a list of technologies that the European Union could supply to Russia to improve energy efficiency, to increase the depth of the exploration, and to improve refineries in Russia. Fourthly, Russia and the European Union talked about a number of infrastructure projects, ranging from the development of Stockman gas field all the way in the north, to the Burgas-Alexandroupolis bypass of the Turkish Straits in the south. Yeah. Most of those projects did not come into being, with the only exception of the Nord Stream, which was put in place. And lastly, Russia and the European Union, during the first stage of the energy dialogue, discussed clean energy. Clean energy being first and foremost energy efficiency, and for the sake of that, the European Union set up 2 centers to demonstrate its best practices, one in Arkhangelsk in the north of Russia, one in Astrakhan in the south of Russia, that allowed the European Union to demonstrate different energy efficiency techniques in different parts of Russia, in different climate zones. And then the third one was set up in Kaliningrad due to the specificity of Kaliningrad. The European Union and Russia also discussed the CO2 emissions, and the energy dialogue contributed to Russia's ratification of the Kyoto Protocol. That was essential at the time because when the United States refused to participate in the Kyoto Protocol fate. The fate of the Kyoto Protocol depended on Russia's ratification, and Russia did ratify the Kyoto Protocol eventually, not least due to the discussions with the European Union. And of course, Russia and the European Union discussed renewables and possibilities of the use of the EU's technologies in Russia. So that was the first stage of the energy dialogue, the exploratory talks on all sorts of different problems, rather patchwork-wise. The situation started to change in 2007 when Russia and the European Union reshuffled the energy dialogue, reshuffled in three groups. Firstly, they started talking about strategies, forecasts and scenarios to explore what was the vision, long-term vision of the energy sector on both sides, and to look for some sort of a shared vision. Secondly, they talked about energy market developments, and thirdly, they talked about energy efficiency. In the field of energy efficiency, the discussion was very efficient. There was quite a bit of equality in that field. There was quite a bit of convergence in strategic thinking, and all in all, there was little politicization. At the same time, market making was quite confrontational because when the European Union talked about market making, it mainly meant liberalization, and that was something fairly hostile for the Russian gas sector at the time. So that was sort of like a period of transition, the second stage. In the year 2010, Russia and the European Union celebrated a 10-year anniversary of the energy dialogue. And they issued a report which outlined progress with the energy dialogue. The following points were identified as results of the energy dialogue. Firstly, modification of long-term contracts for the supply of natural gas so that they were preserved. Secondly, contribution to Russia's ratification of the Kyoto Protocol. Thirdly, maritime safety and phasing out of single-hull tankers in the framework of the International Maritime Organization. Fourthly, cooperation on gas flaring, renewables, energy efficiency. Fifthly, feasibility study on the synchronization of electricity grids between Russia and the European Union. Russia wanted and still wants to export electricity to the European Union, and for the synchronization of electricity grids is needed. And lastly, a joint energy reform to talk about all sorts of supply problems, potential or real. So this is a very good list, a very important list. But at the same time, Russia and the European Union realized that that was far from strategic cooperation, and therefore they decided to launch a new stage of the energy dialogue. And therefore, the third stage of the energy dialogue took place between 2011 and 2013, and it's mainly linked with the roadmap for the period to 2050. The document was first presented in 2012, and then it was signed in March 2013. The document was quite innovative for EU-Russian relations. It was innovative because, first of all, it outlined some common for Russia and the European Union challenges in the field of energy. The challenges were three. Firstly, increased competition for resources at the global level. Secondly, price volatility. And thirdly, climate change, global warming, the fate of nuclear energy. And the challenges were important because they gave a reason for Russia and the European Union to do a shared long-term planning, to do some steps to develop their energy policy and energy relations so as to converge. The approach that was developed in the energy roadmap for the period to 2050 is curious. It says that the EU and Russian energy policies are different, but there do exist areas where these policies converge and thereby mutual beneficial synergies may arise, which couldn't be reached without deep energy cooperation. And the energy roadmap further specified that this synergy would result in some rules convergence and in the construction of shared infrastructure. So the combination of legal provisions and physical infrastructure in order to construct something like a common market in the field of energy. The roadmap then continued and examined electricity, gas, oil, energy efficiency and renewables. And the idea behind was to look at the situation in Russia, to look at the situation in the European Union and to identify short-term and long-term steps for cooperation of Russia and the European Union. So in that sense, the roadmap was innovative because it outlined steps and it set clear deadlines for each of the area. However, the implementation was still at the very early stage when the 2014 crisis came to EU-Russian relations, bringing the fourth and the current stage of the EU-Russian energy dialogue. What is this period linked with? Well, firstly, it's definitely linked with sanctions, which led to blacklisting a number of companies and a number of people, both in Russia and in the European Union. Secondly, sanctions were also about technologies. Sanctions limited the supply of technologies for certain oil exploration in Russia, and sanctions limited access of Russia to financial markets. We speak about EU sanctions. There are also US sanctions, as we know, which are synchronized to a considerable extent with those of the European Union, but which are stricter and which involve more Russian energy companies than sanctions of the European Union. The fate of the roadmap is not clear as a result. There are two different opinions about the fate of the roadmap as of today. Some experts would say that actually the roadmap is preserved, it's a safety net, because Russia and the European Union know what they ideally would like to do together, and therefore they can tacitly work towards that goal. At the same time, some Russian officials say that actually we have to admit that the roadmap is dead and we have to start a new, maybe with a less ambitious plan. And so it's open to the debate, and actually the fate of the roadmap depends to a large extent on the political will of both parties. In any case, what we witness today is a certain race of diversification on the part of both Russia and the European Union, with Russia trying to increase the share of Asian markets and the EU trying to increase the circle of its producers so as to not to rely too much on Russia. So this is about the substance of the energy dialogue. Let's look at the structures of the energy dialogue. When the energy dialogue was set up for the first time in the year 2000, institutions, structures of the energy dialogue were nearly missing. In the year 2001, Russia and the European Union set up 4 thematic groups to develop the content of the energy dialogue. There was also a group of interlocutors, high interlocutors, consisting of the EU's Commissioner for Energy and Russian Minister for Energy and the Vice Prime Minister at the time. And these 4 groups, under the guidance of these 2 sole interlocutors, developed their agenda. The agenda was then upgraded again in the year 2006, when 4 more groups, 4 groups were set up again, again for a short period of time to further develop the content and to modernize it a little bit. And finally, in 2006, Russia and the European Union set up an early warning mechanism following the crisis on the transit through Ukraine. That mechanism was then reviewed in 2009, modernized, updated, and enlarged. But all in all, if you look at the structures during the first stage of the energy dialogue, they were very scarce, and they didn't enable any sort of transgovernmental or transnational cooperation. Well, they did enable some, but that was sort of like very patchy, and basically it was mostly for the preparation of the progress report for the energy dialogue rather than for day-to-day work. The situation started to change in 2007, when for the first time three permanent thematic groups were set up. A thematic group on strategies, forecasts and scenario, a thematic group on energy market development, and a thematic group on energy efficiency. There are also several subgroups, a subgroup on energy investments, subgroup on infrastructure projects, early warning mechanism, subgroup on economic aspects of energy. We see here that transgovernmental and transnational networks start to emerge. And transgovernmental and transnational levels become thicker, denser, which enables day-to-day contacts and mutual socialization of Russian and EU representatives. I'm deliberately saying representatives because subgroups, thematic groups and subgroups included not only officials, but also representatives of business and expert community, experts, representatives of the expert community. So it was, the membership was quite diverse, that ensured a balanced representation of various interests and views and a certain progress with the agenda. The structures were further updated in 2011. The thematic groups were restructured a little bit, so as to take into account the process of the Partnership for Modernization, which was launched by the EU and Russia in the year 2010. And therefore, two thematic groups dealt with two priorities of the Russian modernization, meaning nuclear energy and energy efficiency. Two thematic groups dealt with processed energy goods, meaning electricity and nuclear energy, reflecting the wish of Russia to export to the European Union not only natural resources, but also something that can be called processed energy goods, like nuclear energy or electricity. And then the thematic group on energy markets was maintained, and the groups on natural gas, given their importance, were sort of like put aside. They involved more private actors, and a an advisory council on natural gas was set up. The structure was slightly reformed again in 2013, due to the fact that the Partnership for Modernization was moving away from the radars of Russian politics, but at the same time the groups on electricity, nuclear energy and energy efficiency were preserved. And given the fact that the energy roadmap was approved, there was a special group on the implementation of the roadmap, and there was a special group on scenarios and forecasts, which also dealt with oil cooperation, whereas natural gas was still with the Gas Advisory Council. And that was the structure of the energy dialogue that was in place when, in fact, relations were frozen in the year 2014, and that, of course, affected energy relations as well. Transnational relations included not only thematic groups and working groups, which I mentioned, they also included networking between associations, like the Eurogas, an association which brings in the European Union representatives of the gas industry, and the Russian Gas Society. Or like Euroelectric, an association which brings together EU's producers of electricity and electricity producers in Russia. There was also an EU-Russian roundtable of industrialists, which provided yet another venue for the discussion among business representatives in the energy. What did sanctions do to all these structures and to all these cooperation at the supranational, international, transgovernmental and transnational levels? Well, firstly, the intergovernmental level was nearly stopped. And that's indeed a pity, but we don't have any summits, and we hardly have meetings between the Minister of Energy and relevant commissioners. They have taken place since 2014, but they're very rare and they mostly deal with crisis management rather than with any long-term planning. In terms of trans-governmental links, talks on all post-PCA arrangements stopped. And that's indeed a pity because at the moment, in terms of legal provisions, EU-Russian energy relations are in a state of the vacuum. There are no thematic groups meetings. Well, there are some informal meetings, ad hoc meetings, when they don't even call themselves thematic groups or working groups. Yeah, they just prefer not to mention the energy dialogue. They just say, okay, sort of like an ad hoc meeting on energy to discuss some problematic issues. In terms of transnational level, meaning civil society interaction, experts interaction, and business interaction, the Gas Advisory Council meetings didn't take place, the official meetings I mean. Some unofficial meetings of working groups, of working parties did take place, but to no result, to no avail, mostly because EU officials prefer to ignore those meetings, and in that sense they over-comply with the instructions. There's a certain worsening of the investment climate in Russia because of the sanctions, because companies are not sure how the sanctions regime will develop, and therefore they are wary of coming to new projects, and they even freeze participation in the projects to which they previously committed. So in that sense, we see a repoliticization of the energy relations and certain weakening of the relations. And that means that the positive achievements of the past years are being undone. Yeah? And there is a serious problem of mutual trust which emerges everywhere, but particularly in energy relations. And I'd like to finish this lecture with a discussion of legal provisions on EU-Russian energy relations. Initially, when the energy dialogue was set up, actually there were no legal provisions in place. And the reason for that was that when the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement was negotiated in the early 1990s, Russia and the European Union also discussed the Energy Charter Treaty. The negotiations ran in parallel, and in some cases negotiators were the same, and it was decided that there was no need to duplicate the provisions of the Energy Charter Treaty in the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement. Therefore, what happened was that the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement just made a reference to the Energy Charter and the Energy Charter Treaty and put a few provisions on energy cooperation. However, Russia never ratified the Energy Charter Treaty. Russia believed that it was more in the interests of consumers than suppliers. Russia also believed that transit provisions were not favorable to Russia because they could make it open its networks for transit of Central Asian gas, for example. Nuclear cooperation was explicitly taken out of the Energy Charter Treaty. And of course, the UCAS case and the appeal of the minority stakeholders of UCAS to the Energy Charter Treaty further discouraged Russia's ratification. So it turned out that Russia did not ratify the Energy Charter Treaty. In fact, it ceased its provisional application, and EU-Russian energy relations were left without any legal basis. Russia and the European Union had to rely on the general norms and on the contracts between commercial entities. The situation, the parties tried to change the situation. For example, in the year 2006, during its G8 presidency, Russia made an effort to develop global legal norms in the energy sector. A general declaration was approved, and it talked about the importance of energy security for all, for global energy security, for equal security for suppliers, transit countries, and consuming countries. It talked about the sovereignty of resources and about non-discriminative access. In April 2009, the Kremlin even advanced a conceptual approach on the future of energy relations based on that declaration, and even presented a draft treaty on ensuring international energy security. The idea behind was to grant more equality to Russia in terms of designing future provisions of the energy regulation. But the European Union didn't pay much attention to those initiatives, much like it didn't pay much attention to the efforts of Russia to change security provisions in Europe. So all in all, like, these efforts of Russia gradually died. In 2012, Russia and the European Union and Russia and the Energy Charter Secretariat discussed possible return of Russia to the Energy Charter Treaty in the context of its modernization, but actually that didn't prove right. Yeah, it didn't stand the test of reality. However, at the same time, Russia became a member of the WTO in August 2012, and therefore some commercial disputes were diverted to the WTO. In particular, Russian dispute with the European Union on the third liberalization package, and the Russian contestation of the energy correction mechanism of the European Union. The WTO, of course, is about crisis management more than about anything else. Russia tried to negotiate with the European Union a separate agreement on pipelines, again to no avail. And it was decided that the treaty will be that the question of legal provisions for the energy sector will be dealt with in the post-PCA agreement of Russia and the European Union. Post-PCA, because the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement was considered old, and therefore Russia, in fact, put the question of modernizing it in the agenda of EU-Russian relations. Russia and the European Union started discussing a future agreement, which was called the post-PCA agreement. Russia and the European Union did not agree on whether detailed provisions on energy had to be put in the core of the text, or whether it would be a protocol of some sort. But in any case, negotiations were frozen in the year 2014, and again Russia and the European Union were left without any legal provisions in the field of energy, and they have to rely on basic international norms, general provisions, and contracts. What do we have now? Well, definitely lack of legal provisions. There were some speculations about a possible Russian return to the Energy Charter and Energy Charter Treaty, at least for the consultation of experts. And some informal consultations do take place, but officially Russia hasn't voiced any ambition to go back to the Energy Charter Treaty. There are some contacts between the European Union and the Eurasian Economic Union on general cooperation that potentially can give a space for some energy discussions. And then, of course, there is the WTO, where Russia and the European Union try to solve some problematic issues, like energy correction mechanism for the Russian export of chemicals and metal, like duties on Russian oil export, on Russian natural gas export, like difference in prices. But that's still an instrument of crisis management more than an instrument of long-term planning. In any case, legal provisions like future-oriented, long-term oriented legal provisions in the field of energy depend at the moment on the general climate of EU-Russian relations, which deserves to be better, but which unfortunately at present is in a very bad state. So this is a short overview of EU-Russian energy relations, and with that I conclude the present lecture, and I welcome you to our new lectures on EU-Russian energy relations.